Another pothead question. Is it possible to look at, speaking of unconventional organisms and going to Richard Dawkins, for example, with memes, is it possible to think of things like ideas? Like, how weird can we get? Can we look at ideas as organisms, then creating barriers for those ideas, then seeing are the ideas themselves? If you take the actual individual ideas and trying to empathize and visualize what kind of space they might be operating in, can they be seen as organisms that have a mind?
Yeah. Okay. If you want to get really weird, we can get really weird here. Uh, think about the caterpillar butterfly transition. Okay. So you got a caterpillar, soft-bodied kind of creature, has a particular controller that's suitable for running a soft-bodied, kind of robot. It has a brain for that task, and then it has to become this butterfly, hard-bodied creature, flies around. Okay? During the process of metamorphosis, its brain is basically ripped up and rebuilt from scratch. Right now, what's been found is that if you train the caterpillar, so you give it a new memory, meaning that if the caterpillar sees this color or disc, then it crawls over and eats some leaves. Turns out the butterfly retains that memory. Now, the obvious question is, how the hell do you retain memories when the medium is being refactored like that? Let's put that aside. I'm going to get somewhere even weirder than that. There's something else that's even more interesting than that. It's not just that you have to retain the memory. You have to remap that memory onto a completely new context, because guess what? The butterfly doesn't move the way the caterpillar moves, and it doesn't care about leaves. It wants nectar from flowers. And so if that memory is going to survive, it can't just persist. It has to
Be remapped.
into a novel context. Now, here's where things get weird. We can take a couple of different perspectives here. We can take the perspective of the caterpillar facing some sort of crazy singularity and say, "My God, I'm gonna cease to exist," but I'll sort of be reborn in this new higher dimensional world where I'll fly. Okay, so that's one thing. We can take the perspective of the butterfly and say that, well, here I am, but I seem to be saddled with some tendencies and some memories, and I don't know where the hell they came from, and I don't remember exactly how I got them, and they seem to be a core part of my psychological makeup, and they come from somewhere. I don't know where they come from, right? So you can take that perspective, but there's a third perspective that I think is really interesting and useful. And the third perspective is that of the memory itself. If you take a perspective of the memory, so what is a memory? It is a pattern. It is an informational pattern that was continuously reinforced within one cognitive system. And now here I am, I'm this memory. What do I need to do to persist into the future? Well, now I'm facing the paradox of change. If I try to remain the same, I'm gone. There's no way the butterfly is going to retain me in the original form that I'm in now. What I need to do is change, adapt, and morph. Now, you might say, well, that's kind of crazy. Well, how are you taking the perspective of a pattern within an excitable medium, right? Agents are physical things. You're talking about talking about information, right? So let me tell you another quick science fiction story. Imagine that some creatures come out from the center of the Earth. They live down in the core. They're super dense. Okay, they're incredibly dense because they live down in the core. They have gamma ray vision and so on. So they come out to the surface. What do they see? Well, all of this stuff that we're seeing here, this is like a thin plasma to them. They are so dense. None of this is solid to them. They don't see any of this stuff. So they're walking around. The planet is sort of covered in this like thin gas. And one of them is a scientist, and he's taking measurements of the gas, and he says to the others, I've been watching this gas, and there are like these little whirlpools in this gas. And they almost look like agents. They almost look like they're doing things. They're moving around. They kind of hold themselves together for a little bit, and they're trying to make stuff happen. And the others say, "Well, that's crazy. Patterns in the gas can't be agents. We are agents. We're solid. This is just patterns in an excitable medium." And by the way, how long do they hold together? He says, "Well, about 100 years." Well, that's crazy. Nothing. No real agent can exist to be that dissipate that fast. Okay, we are all metabolic patterns, among other things, right? And so one of the things that and so you see what I'm warming up to here. So one of the things that we've been trying to dissolve, and this is like some work that I've done with Chris Fields and others, is this distinction between thoughts and thinkers. So all agents are patterns within some excitable medium. We could talk about what that is, and they can spawn off others. And now you can have a really interesting spectrum. Here's the spectrum. You can have fleeting thoughts, which are like waves in the ocean when you throw a rock in, they sort of go through the excitable medium and then they're gone. They pass through and they're gone, right? So those are kind of fleeting thoughts. Then you can have patterns that have a degree of persistence. So they might be hurricanes or solitons or persistent thoughts or earworms or depressive thoughts. Those are harder to get rid of. They stick around for a little while. They often do a little bit of niche construction, so they change the actual brain to make it easier to have more of those thoughts, right? Like that's a thing. And so they stay around longer. Now, uh, what's further than that? Well, personality fragments of a dissociative personality disorder, they're more stable and they're not just on autopilot. They have goals and they can do things. And then past that is a full-blown human personality. And who the hell knows what's past that? Maybe some sort of transhuman, transpersonal, like, I don't know, right? But this idea, again, I'm back to this notion of a spectrum. There is not a sharp distinction between, we are real agents and then we have these thoughts. Yeah, patterns can be agents too. But again, you don't know until you do the experiment. So if you want to know whether a soliton or a hurricane or a thought within a cognitive system is its own agent, do the experiment. See what it can do. Can it learn from experience? Does it have memories? Does it have goal states? Does it, what can it do, right? Does it have language? So coming back to then your original question, yeah, we can definitely apply this methodology to ideas and concepts and social, whatevers, but you've got to do the experiment.
That's such a challenging thought experiment of like thinking about memories from the caterpillar to the butterfly as an organism. I think at the very basic level, intuitively, we think of organisms as hardware.
Yeah.
And software is not possibly being able to be organisms. But
Right.
what you're saying is that it's all just patterns in an excitable medium, and it doesn't really matter what the pattern is. We need to, and what the excitable medium is. We need to do the testing of how persistent is it, how goal oriented is it, and there's certain kind of tests to do that. And you can apply that to memories, you can apply that to ideas, you can apply that to anything really. I mean, you could probably think about like consciousness. There's really no boundary to what you can imagine. Probably really, really wild things could be minds.
Yeah, stay tuned. I mean, this is exactly what we're doing. We're getting progressively like more and more unconventional. I mean, so this whole distinction between software and hardware, I think it's a super important uh, concept to think about. And yet the way we've mapped it onto the world, I would like to blow that up in the following way. And again, I want to point out, so I'll tell you what the practical consequences are, because this is not just fun stories that we tell each other. These have really important research implications. Think about a Turing machine. So one thing you can say is the machine's the agent. It has passive data, and it operates on the data. And that's it. The story of agency is the story of whatever that machine can and can't do. The data is passive and it moves it around. You can tell the opposite story. You can say, look, the patterns on the data are the agent. The machine is a stigmergic scratch pad in the world of the data doing what data does. The machine is just the consequences, the scratch pad of it working itself out. And both of those stories make sense depending on what you're trying to do. Here's the biomedical side of things. So our program in bioelectrics and aging, okay? One model you could have is the physical organism is the agent, and the cellular collective has pattern memories, specifically what I was saying before, goals, anatomical goals. If you want to persist for 100 plus years, your cells better remember what your correct shape is and where the new cells go, right? So there are these pattern memories. They exist during embryogenesis, during regeneration, during resistance to aging. We can see them, we can visualize them. One thing you can imagine is, fine, the physical body, the cells are the agent. The electrical pattern memories are just data. And what might happen during aging is that the data might get degraded. They might get fuzzy. And so what we need to do is reinforce the data, reinforce the memories, reinforce the pattern memories. That's one specific research program, and we're doing that. But that's not the only research program, because the other thing you might imagine is that what if the patterns are the agent in exactly the same sense as we think in our brains. It's the patterns of electrophysiological computations and whatever else that is the agent, right?
Mhm.
And that what they're doing in the brain are the side effects of the patterns working themselves out. And those side effects might be to fire off some muscles and some glands and some other things. From that perspective, maybe what's actually happening is maybe the agent's finding it harder and harder to be embodied in the physical world. Why? Because the cells might get less um, responsive. In other words, the cells are sluggish. The patterns are fine. They're having a harder time making the cells do what they need to do. And that maybe what you need to do is not reinforce the memories. Maybe what you need to do is make the cells more responsive to them. And that is a different research agenda, so which we are also doing. And we have evidence for that as well, actually, now. And then we published it recently. And so my point here is when we tell these crazy sci-fi stories, the only worth to them and the only reason I'm talking about them now, and I hadn't been up, a year ago, I wasn't talking about this stuff, is because these are now actionable in terms of specific experimental research agendas that are heading to the clinic, I hope, in some of these biomedical approaches. And so now here we can go beyond this and we can say, okay, so up until now, we've considered what are disease states? Well, we know there's organic disease. Something is physically broken. We can see the tissue is breaking down. There's damage in the joint, what the liver is doing, whatever. We can see these things. But what about disease states that are not physical states? They're physiological states or informational states or cognitive problems. So, in other words, in all of these other spaces, you can start to ask, what's a barrier in gene expression space? What's a local minimum that traps you in physiological state space? And what is a stress pattern that keeps itself together, moves around the body, causes damage, tries to keep itself going, right? What level of agency does it have? This suggests an entirely different set of approaches to biomedicine. And anybody who's let's say in the alternative medicine community is probably yelling at the screen and saying, We've been saying this for hundreds of years," and yeah. And I'm well aware these are not the ideas are not new. What's new is being able to now take this and make them actionable and say, yeah, but we can image this now. I can now actually see the bioelectric patterns and why they go here and not there. And we have the tools that now hopefully will get us to therapeutics. So this is very actionable stuff, and it all leans on not assuming we know minds when we see them, because we don't, and we have to do experiments.
To return back to the software hardware distinction, you're saying that we can see the software as the organism and the hardware is just the scratch pad, or you can see the hardware as the organism and the software is the thing that the hardware generates. And in so doing, we can decrease the amount of importance we assign to something like the human brain, or it could be the activations, it could be the electrical signals that are the organisms, and then the brain is the scratch pad.
And by saying scratch pad, I don't mean it's not important. When we get to talking about the Platonic space, we have to talk about how important the interface actually is. It's the scratch pad isn't unimportant. The scratch pad is critical. It's just that my only point is that when we have these formalisms of software, of hardware, of other things, the way we map those formalisms onto the world is not obvious. It's not given to us. We get used to certain things, right? But who's the hardware, who's the software, who's the agent, and who's the excitable medium is to be determined.